Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilts, back with another fun quilt for you to make. This one is called Terrace Tiles, and it's one of my favorite go-to designs. In fact, I probably made this quilt at least half a dozen times, all with different fabrics. Well, for this week's video, I have made this version, a citrus colored version, using my Dazzle Dots fabric collection from Benartex. This fabric collection includes 22 gorgeous prints in jewel and citrus tones, and I thought it would be really fun to take half of it and make this colorway. Be sure to watch my other video to see the exact same quilt made in another colorway too. For this particular quilt, it comes in several different sizes, and for this size, I made it from exactly 11 fat quarters. That includes all of the piece blocks and the binding. And so it's really fun and goes together simply. And like I said, it's my absolute easiest quilt pattern that you can make. To go along with the really simple quilt pattern, I wanted to quilt it with a very simple, fast and easy quilting design. I've quilted wavy lines in both directions, forming a really fun, irregular wavy grid. It's a simple design that you can do with the walking foot, and I will share some tips and tricks in just a moment. But if you want to make this quilt, be sure to grab the Terrace Tiles pattern, 11 fat quarters or more or less, depending on how big you want to make your quilt, and get started. You can literally make this quilt in a weekend. The color scheme on this one is really easy. Pretty much just grab any fabrics that you like, pair them up with a very contrasting fabric here, either a light fabric or a dark fabric, and it's gonna look great. So follow the pattern directions for all of the cutting and piecing, but I'll throw in a couple bonus tips. So when I cut out my fabrics from fat quarters, I like to stack up 4 at a time and make sure that I have a long ruler. I can cut quickly and efficiently this way. And I'm cutting using my Christa Quilts ergonomic rotary cutter. It makes the job easy and my hands don't get tired. When sewing the blocks together, sew with a skinny strip on top, and that will keep the blocks from warping out of shape. I actually sewed my entire quilt top together when I was on a vacation recently at the beach, and so I brought along my Singer Featherweight. It was fun to hang up my little blocks out of the window, and so people walking by probably wondered and thought that a quilter was there. I like to press my seams open so the blocks will lie nice and flat. Now, usually I lay out my blocks on a design wall, but because I didn't have one handy, I used the floor instead, and I just rotated them into a pleasing arrangement and laid them out according to the pattern directions. Then I generously used a lot of pins to pin the rows together. I actually made 2 tops while I was there, and you'll be able to check out the other video for the jewel colored version of this quilt. Now, when I returned home, it was time to quilt and baste. I have a nice big roll of batting from Hobbs Batting. I like their Tuscany cotton and wool blend, and I was actually able to get 2 pieces of batting from the same roll because it was folded in half. I'm using my batting scissors to easily cut it off the roll. So here's how I spray baste. I take the top and the backing outside and I turn it wrong side up. I'm using 505 basting spray, and I put a light coating of spray on one part of the quilt, and then I do the same thing for the other. You can do the top first and then the backing, but it doesn't really matter. Once I'm done spraying the adhesive on both pieces, I fold them up wrong sides together, and then I take them inside to finish the assembly on my design wall. So I'm pinning the backing to my design wall first, and I'm making sure that the wrong side is out, because of course that's the part that's going to touch the batting. I'm using a long acrylic ruler to smooth out each layer of the quilt. Now I'm taking that batting that I pre-cut and I'm smoothing it out. I'm not worrying about lining everything up perfectly. As long as the backing is bigger than the batting and the quilt top, I'm good to go. So I'll just take a few minutes, smooth everything out, because if all 3 layers are nice and smooth, that's going to make for a better quilting experience. And then my quilt top should be smaller than my batting and backing. I'm going to take a few minutes and smooth that out, also using the same ruler. Now I'm using a separate ruler. This is not the one I use to cut. You can wash off the excess spray, but I just use a second one only for basting. The other nice thing about using a long acrylic ruler to smooth out the layers is that you can use it to kind of wiggle any wayward blocks back into place, and you can make sure that all the blocks in the rows are nicely aligned. I'm going to use my Christa Quilts batting shears to trim off all the excess around all 4 sides of the quilt. I'm trimming up and only leaving about an inch or 2 around all 4 sides. This will help reduce the bulk under the machine and lessen the chances that you're going to quilt through more than 3 layers. Final step in my spray basting process is to iron the quilt on both sides. I'm just using an inexpensive iron, and I'm using what's called a big board that fits on top of my regular ironing board. It gives me lots of space to work, and it makes it easier even when I'm basting a large quilt. So I'm ironing all of the back side of the quilt first, and then I'm going to iron the front side. It does 2 things. Number 1, it sets the glue so it's not going to shift on you. And the second thing is it allows me a second chance to work out any bubbles or wrinkles on the quilt. Doing this ironing along with the use of the 505 basting spray eliminates the need for any pins, and it's wonderful when you're quilting to not have any pesky pins sticking in your way. So here's a little video diagram showing how I'm going to do this design. It works on any quilt you can think of. I visually divide the quilt into 2, and then I start quilting wavy lines from the right-hand side of the quilt towards the middle. Once I reach the middle of the quilt, I rotate the quilt 180 degrees, then I keep working from the middle all the way over to the other side of the quilt. This will anchor the quilt for additional quilting. For my grid design, I'm going to rotate the quilt now 90 degrees, visually divide it again, and start from the right-hand side, working my way to the center, rotating the quilt, and then working back to the other side. This is one pass of the wavy grid in both directions. Depending on how close I want my lines to be, I can continue quilting additional lines. To get things started, I am actually marking in between each of the blocks where I don't have a pieced seam. This will kind of give me something to follow along. I'm using my Christa Quilts crease marker, and it just creates a nice little crease line for me to follow. Now I'm excited to show you how to actually quilt this yummy grid texture. So first of all, I'm wearing my Christa Quilts machine quilting gloves. These have grips on the fingertips that allow me to hold onto the quilt and get a better grip on it so that it's much easier to shove through the bed of the machine. So I'm starting on the right hand side, and my machine is set to a regular straight stitch, and I've increased the stitch length to 3.0. Now I've already filled in a couple of the wavy lines from the very edge, and I'm about 2 or 3 rows in. All I'm doing is stitching a very simple straight line, but I'm wiggling the quilt as I go, and that's going to form these organic wavy lines. Now I know what you're thinking. A lot of people always ask me, they say, can't you just use a decorative stitch on your sewing machine? And you absolutely can. However, that's going to give you a completely different look, and I have other videos showing how to do that design. But for my Terrace Tiles quilt in the citrus colorway that I'm showing you here, I'm quilting the easiest design, which is a simple organic wavy line. Now in this close-up, you can see that I'm stitching roughly in the middle of each block. In those blocks that have that darker strip in between, I can just kind of wiggle that line in between. In the areas where I don't have a pieced line to follow, that's where I had marked some lines with my crease marker. You don't necessarily have to mark those lines. You can also just eyeball it for an even more organic look. You can see that most of the bulk of the quilt is going to be resting right there on my Christa cabinet, and those nice quilt blocks are going to keep the quilt from falling off the back or side of the table while I quilt. So by this time, I have completed my first pass of quilting across the quilt in one direction. I quilted lines from the top to the bottom, and now I've rotated the quilt so that the lines I just stitched now look like they're going horizontal. That's of course because I can only stitch in one direction. So now I'm going to apply the same process that I shared in the diagram earlier. I started on the right hand side of the quilt, and I'm quilting anchor quilting lines about 4 to 5 inches across, all the way across the quilt. The reason my lines are that widely spaced is because I'm doing that based on the size of the quilt block. Now I'm actually using the 20D foot on my Bernina sewing machine with the integrated dual feed. My dual feed mechanism is something that is attached and built into my machine, but you know what? It performs the exact same function as a walking foot. So you could do the same technique using a walking foot on any machine. Once I've quilted enough lines so that now I'm at about the halfway point across the quilt, I'm going to stitch off the edge, cut the threads, and then I'm going to rotate that quilt 180 degrees. So what I just quilted from right to the center of the quilt, all of that quilting is now going to be on my left-hand side, and the rest of the bulk under the machine will get less and less as I work my way from the center of the quilt back over to the right-hand side. Again, the key is to slightly wiggle the quilt back and forth to form the wavy lines. And I'm filming this in real time at real speed so you can get a really good feel for what I'm doing. But just remember, this is called walking foot quilting, not running foot quilting. I do tend to stitch quickly, but if you want a little bit more control over your stitches, you can slow down a little bit as you like. And you can see how that basting spray worked really well to keep all the layers together. Now, one other tip that really works well for my sewing machine is I lower my presser foot pressure to 0, and that allows my foot to glide on top of the quilt. The feed dogs are still up, they're engaged just like you would do for normal sewing, but this gives me a nice smooth stitch with no puckers. That's especially important when you're stitching in both directions. Once I stitch one row, I'm going to pull the quilt back through the machine, start at the edge of the quilt in the batting, and continue to quilt a continuous line all the way across the quilt. I like to start and end in the batting and quilt my lines from edge to edge across the quilt so that I don't have to worry about starting or stopping or tying off my thread tails. I like to show you different perspectives while I'm machine quilting so you can see what it really looks like when you're going to be sitting down at your machine performing the same function. And this is what it looks like with one pass across the quilt in both directions. Now the fun part is up to you. You get to decide how many more passes you'd like to stitch across the quilt. Each time you quilt, you're going to divide and conquer. You're going to quilt a line in between the previous two lines and keep going until you're happy with the desired density. So now I'm quilting my next pass across the quilt, and my lines are approximately 2 inches apart. What I try to recommend is not doing it all in one setting. Take your time. Maybe do one half of the lines one way, take a break, come back, do some more lines another way, and that's going to allow you to just methodically quilt your quilt without feeling overwhelmed. But you know what? This is actually a quick and easy design, so it does not take you very long. Now I'll speed things up a bit, but I'm basically doing the same thing. Lots of wavy lines, dividing and conquering. Too bad I'm not this quick in real life. As you can see, the more I quilt the lines, the more the individual stitches seem to disappear into the quilt, and you're not going to really notice the threads, you're not going to really notice imperfections. All you're going to see is this really yummy texture. So again, here's another still shot showing the lines quilted, and they're about 2 inches apart. Now you can see what it looks like with me at the whole sewing machine with my nice lovely Christa cabinet and the quilt blocks holding the quilt together. So again, just to repeat my process, I'm starting on the right hand side of the quilt and I'm working my way towards the center. Once I have quilted all of the lines and I reach the center of the quilt, I cut thread and then I rotate the entire quilt. So in other words, I have just quilted a whole bunch of lines, and now what I just quilted is off to my left hand side. I'm continuing to quilt from the middle back to the other side. So think about it this way. When you start quilting from the right-hand side, your quilt is going to get bulkier and bulkier under the machine. Then once you've reached that center point and you rotate the quilt, it will get less and less bulky. So here's the close-up view showing me dividing and conquering the final time. My lines were 2 inches apart and now I am making them about 1 inch apart. You could definitely quilt them as wide or narrowly spaced as you like. I usually like about a 1 inch spacing because that allows me to see the grid while still having that really yummy texture. Anything closer and the grid kind of gets lost. And you know what? When I say they're about 1 inch apart, maybe some of the lines are 1 1/4 inches, maybe some are 3/4. I don't worry too much about them all being perfectly evenly spaced. It's texture that I'm going for over perfection. Here's another wide shot as I'm finishing up all of those lines that are about 1 inch apart. And remember, I'm quilting from top to bottom to get all the vertical lines. Next, I'm rotating the quilt 90 degrees so that the other lines that look like they're going to be horizontal on the quilt, they are quilted at a roughly 90-degree angle so it looks like you have a really nice intersection. Now, if you were free motion quilting this design, you wouldn't necessarily have to rotate your quilt so much, but this design is so easy when done with the walking foot that doing that extra rotating is worth it to me, and it ends up being a faster process in the end. Now, I do have a machine that has a large throat space. I have 10 inches of space to work with, but you know what? Even before I got this machine, my previous machine only had 6 inches of space and it was the same technique and it worked great. As long as you have a nice flat quilt, nice thin batting, it's really going to be easier to just focus on one line at a time. I'm just going to continue to stitch and quilt and enjoy. This is kind of my Zen moment doing all this machine quilting. So while I'm quilting, I'm just listening to a podcast or an audiobook, and I'm just really enjoying the process. You can kind of see the other colorway of this quilt. That's a completely separate video I'm doing with a completely different design, so stay tuned for that. So in reality, I did 4 passes across the quilt in both directions, or 8 rounds of stitching. Think about it this way. I stitched lines approximately 8 inches apart, and then 4 inches apart, and then 2 inches apart, and then 1 inch. All right, here's another close-up where my lines are approximately 1 inch apart, and I'm getting just about to the edge of the quilt. So I've worked my way from one side towards the middle, rotating the quilt, and now I'm finishing up with the last few lines of stitching. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and now it's time to trim it up and bind it. So now I'm trimming up the edges of my quilt flush so the binding is going to fit on nice and tightly. I use the largest square acrylic ruler that I can, and I trim off all 4 corners. I start with one corner and then I do each of the other 3 corners. The reason I trim it up flush is so that it's nice and even, and with those nice big blocks you can keep them square and make sure that everything is going to line up really nicely. It's nice working with big blocks because if you need to trim off just a little tiny bit of it, it's not going to be that noticeable. So once I trim up all 4 corners, I take a large acrylic ruler and then I trim up the sides. First one and then the next until all 4 sides are trimmed up, and then I just throw that little scrap away. I know some people like to keep their scraps and they can stuff them into pillowcases and turn them into animal beds, which that's a really great use of your scraps. So once it's nice and trimmed up, it's time to apply the binding. I made the binding from leftover strips, and I actually like to cut my bindings pretty thin, only 2 inches wide, so that the binding is going to finish at about 1/4 inch on either side. If you're not sure and you want to cut them a tiny bit wider, like 2 1/4, that'll give you a little more wiggle room, but it's the same method. Oh, one other tip. Usually if I'm using the same fabric, I will use mitered seams for the bindings, but when I'm doing a scrappy binding like this, I will just use straight seams to join the binding strips together. I'm going to leave about 8 to 10 inches of tail that I can join up later. I'm sewing with an exact 1/4 inch seam. When I get to the corner, I'm going to stop at 1/4 inch away, so I'm stopping 1/4 inch away from the edge. Then I rotate and I sew off the corner, and that's going to give me my nice little miter. Now I do something called the funky fold, which is where I lift the binding up and then I fold it back over itself. Feel free to go back and re-watch this several times until you really understand how this fold occurs. The idea is that you want that top fold to line up right there with the edge of the quilt, nice and even. And you know what? If you end up getting seams at your corners, you can just kind of rip that off, cut off the binding a little bit and move that seam over so that you don't ever get a seam in your corner. Once you fold the binding back down on itself, you just continue to sew that 1/4 inch on the other side. You can test your corners by flipping them over to see if they're going to make that nice miter. And you know what? Don't stress too much if you don't get it perfect the first time. This comes with practice. So I'm going to continue to sew all 4 sides and 4 corners the same way. Once I get near the end, I'm going to leave about an 8 to 10 inch tail. I'm going to take that starting tail and I'm going to open it up. So you'll see I have a gap. I have a little starting tail and an ending tail. Here's how I make them line up so that you don't have any lumps or bumps. Then I'm going to take the ending tail and place it right inside the starting tail. You want this to be nice and smooth and even so that you don't get any lumps or bumps. That's going to tell you exactly where the 2 seams are going to line up. Then just take any type of marking pen that's not going to bleed through, maybe a washable pen, and you're going to mark that line so that you know where they intersect. But you know what? Now you have to add seam allowances to your marked line. You need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to make up for both sides of the piece. This is where my little mini mat and ruler come in handy. I can just plop it right there next to my sewing machine so I don't have to get up and move the quilt. And then just trim off that extra 1/2 inch. Then I take the 2 binding ends, I move my little mat and ruler out of the way, and I can just match those up, make sure you haven't twisted it, and I can pin them together in place, then sew with a regular 1/4 inch seam. The hardest part is just finagling those ends under the machine, so I always start with a little leader or ender scrappy piece so that I don't make a big mess when I'm sewing. Sew my little 1/4 inch seam ending, and that's going to make a nice join. Now I just take the little seam and I finger press it. I don't have to get up and use the iron. And then I'm going to pin it back into place and I'm going to check to make sure that I don't have any lumps or bumps and that my estimated math was pretty good there. This is all nicely pinned in place, then I'm just going to pick up where I left off. I'm going to stitch a few stitches on top of my previous line of stitching, and then I'm going to keep on going. I'm just going to fill in, stitch through that entire gap. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to stitch on top of the previous line of stitching to kind of lock those stitches in place. Now I can fold it over and it looks really nice, and I can ensure that when I fold it over to the back side, I'm going to get coverage. Now at this point, you can either finish sewing this by hand or machine. I like to use binder clips to hold my binding down. Look at my other videos. I have a more in-depth of how I do the actual stitching. On this particular quilt, I actually finished the binding by machine using a decorative stitch. The nice thing about using a decorative stitch is it doesn't matter which side you stitch the binding on, because it looks like the decorative stitches become a part of the design. And there you have it. There's my finished quilt, all done by machine. Well, I sure hope you enjoyed that video. I really want to help make machine quilting less intimidating, more fun, so that you guys can finish your quilts. Because if you're like me, you're always thinking about that next quilt that you want to make. So I hope you enjoyed taking a look at Terrace Tiles made with my lovely Dazzle Dots fabric. This is one of those no-fail designs. If you decide to make it, please let me know. That would make my day. Until next time, happy quilting.